Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface Lesson 6. At this point in the course, I've shown you the basics as well as how to model in a production environment, so now you have a pretty good idea of what is involved in the edge extrusion workflow. However, I haven't gone in and taken a more detailed look at some smaller objects that include features you'll be faced with creating day to day. So in this lesson, I'll be adopting the same approach I used in my Hard Surface Essentials tutorial and begin breaking down some of these examples for you. A few of these are ones I personally wanted to cover, and others are direct responses to requests I've gotten via email. So if you've got your own request for topics like this, I'll extend the lesson into 2 parts and focus on your own ideas in part 2. So just send me an email if you've got something you'd like covered, and I'll do my best to fit it in. As you can see, I've already prepared a few objects for us to recreate. All of these include features I commonly use in my own designs. And early in my career, I created objects like this, mostly for practice and to increase my speed. But because of their simplicity, there's really awesome potential for reusing geometry like this in more than one place. So in later lessons, I'll show you how you can merge items like this into larger models and quickly increase the detail and overall quality of your designs. The first piece we're going to create is a bit of inset detail into a flat panel. You'll often find details like this on sci-fi guns or doors or anything kind of industrial where you've got panels that have little insets like this. In order to complicate things a little bit further, I've made sure that it's angled on the inset, so you can see up the top left it's nearly flat, and on the right it's inset further. So to first create this piece, I'm just going to create a flat plane that's roughly the same size. And while I'm doing that, I'll just let you know that I'm not going to go in and recreate these exactly. So I'm just going to loosely base it around the ideas I've got up the top here. So the first thing I've done is I've created a plane, and I'm just going to assign the correct material. The next thing I want to do is convert it to an edible poly. So at this point, the surface is totally flat, and this is where you should probably consider how you want your inset to look, because after you've done the bevel in, it's going to be very hard to tweak that geometry vertically because of the angle on the inset. So make sure you've got it right here first. I'm just going to swap to vertice mode and use the cut tool to just loosely cut a similar shape. Without worrying about topology, I'm just going to go in and select all these inside polygons. And then I'm just going to use the inset tool to bring those polygons in a little bit. You can see here as I'm doing that, there's a little bit of a problem in some parts of the geometry. So I'm going to cancel that, go to vertice mode, and just weld this piece up. You want to try and avoid vertices being too close together, because sometimes when you inset them, they can overlap. So once again, I'm just going to inset this. And at this point, I can start worrying about kind of cleaning up some of this messy topology here. And because the surface is going to be flat, you don't have to keep things flowing perfectly. And a lot of what I was talking about in earlier lessons about making topology nice and flowing doesn't apply here, because we're simply trying to create detail as fast as possible and as efficiently as possible. And as I've always said, if you've got a flat area on your mesh, the topology doesn't matter at all as long as it's kind of nice around the areas where you need to harden that off, which I'll get into a bit later here. So using the target weld tool, I'm just going to fix up some of these inside points and get rid of these triangles. If you end up with areas like this, feel free to just remove it and deal with a 5-sided point. On the outside of the mesh, we need to make sure that any unterminated loops get terminated off. So just using the cut tool, I'm just going to quickly pull those out. And as I'm doing this, it's important to note that because we are doing things in the simplest way possible, you might not always flow the topology out like this if you were trying to merge or cut detail like this into a mesh you've already got created. But because we're dealing with a flat plane, none of that really matters, and all this topology flowing out at the edge can just be done however you like. On an area like this, I'm just going to get rid of these two pieces. Because once again, those flat areas simply aren't going to matter. You can see I'm just making a couple of small adjustments here. Sometimes just to potentially make things easier later on when I'm going to add detail to this inside part, I will just do a little bit of quick cleanup. So we're starting to clean up this inside area, and at this point it's probably a better idea to add any details you want inside this part now as opposed to adding them later when you've got that angled surface, and it's going to make things a little bit harder to keep things clean. Things like circles and little design features you might include. So at this point what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select a couple of areas to add some inset detail. I'm just going to inset that, and then using that tool I showed you earlier, the regularize tool, I'm just going to create some of these circular insets. If you don't have enough geometry, and I always recommend having 8 points when you create circles, because if you have 6 it won't be a perfectly mathematical circle. So feel free to cut in your own edge loops in order to support detail like this. And now I'm just going to go in and select all of this geometry because I've created those bits of detail, and we're just going to start pushing those in and getting that angle right. Now there's a little trick I like to use here, and rather than just rotating flat like this, you'll see now that the edge loop, this edge here sticks out of the surface. In order to avoid that, I just want to change the pivot of where I'm rotating from. So in the hierarchy tab, if we go to edit working pivot, we can change that to wherever we want. Then using the use working pivot button, now that when we go to that selection, our pivot's always going to be there no matter what we select. And it's just a much quicker way of just kind of bringing in detail like this. If it's not perfect, feel free to just go up from above. And like I've always said, I don't do things absolutely mathematically correct. I just like to eyeball things because it's much quicker. Just try and move that last vertex just a little bit further in. For the next step, we need to inset this detail now so that we do create a hard edge at the base of that inset. Feel free to keep it whatever distance you want. This will gauge how hard this rounded area is. And if I just cancel this and add a turbo smooth on top of the geometry, you'll see that as I'm insetting, the closer I go to this edge is the harder it becomes. When I'm modeling, I usually like to do things a little bit softer than most people. And the reason for that is because when I go to render things, all the edges pick up really nice highlights. I've seen a lot of guys end up doing little bevels and their inset is so tight that the edge just doesn't pick up a highlight, and it makes things so much harder to look real in CGI when you don't have edges being picked up. Because we're dealing with anti-aliasing in render engines, small corners and things like that are often a lot more harshly visualized than if you were taking a photo of the same object. So that's why I always like to just do things a little bit wider. The next step is we need to go in and create that same support loop on the outside. As usual, I'm not going to do things mathematically. I'm just going to try and roughly use the cut tool to cut around the edge here. Without worrying about the topology mess we're creating while doing this, because that'll be the next step in cleanup. So now, because I've created this support edge loop, geometry like this, I can just merge down on the outside, and sorry, I've still got the same pivot selected, so just go into the hierarchy tab and just untick that use working pivot. I'm just going to enable isoline display on the turbo smooth, and then I'm just going to move these points on the edge just until they're roughly flat. The reason I don't do all this stuff so perfectly is because the difference isn't noticeable by eye. You can see if I move this just this little bit, even if we move it quite a bit, the user or anyone visualizing this type of stuff, it's just too small to tell. You can see there, I've turned on the edge snap toggle just so that we're not coming off the rails of that loop. And then I'm going to do the same thing I did up here and just merge that point in. I'm just looking for areas to clean. You can see down here we've got a potentially messy area, so I'm just going to select this edge loop, and we've still got the edge constraint selected, so I'm just going to merge that down and make that just a little bit more even. And I'm going to try and do that down here too. If you want to create a hard edge out of this, feel free to go in and select that edge and add a chamfer to it. And when you do that, sorry, it's just gone off. When you do that, you can just clean that up at the base here. So I'm going to do that for both of these points. Now that edge, because we use the same chamfer setting, has the same hardness. Because this is all one inset edge loop, or edge ring I should say, I can go in and select that, and what I want to do now is I want to evenly connect a point between these two. But if I use the connect at this stage, you'll see what happens is, when I set it to 2 segments, the difference in spacing between down here and up here isn't exactly aligned. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that, accept that, select this edge loop, with edge constraint toggle selected, I'm just going to move it forward and then move it back just a little bit. I've shown you that technique in earlier lessons, but once again you can use that a lot to do things like this. You can see it's just creating a little bit of an issue up here where we've got a lot of geometry overlapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go up here, and unselect these points and then pull them out. And now we've avoided that kind of pinch off. I'm just going to select this one point and just move that out just a little bit. Same goes for the inside. I'm just going to unselect these points and then move these in. And now we've created a nice hard bevel on the inside, but still soft enough where we're picking up an edge. It's probably just a little bit too hard for my liking though. So I'm just going to move that out just a bit. Once again, I can just select these edges that I want to be the same roundness, and I'm just going to use the chamfer tool and then clean up the inside. So when I do that, I select the edges, have connect, sorry, not connect, hit the chamfer options box, hit tick, straight away I swap to vertice mode, then I hit Q to go to target weld, and then target weld them. And that's just a process I've picked up over time to memorize little commands like that to make things go faster. So if I undo it and do it in real time, it's just a connect, tick. Sorry, I've just stuffed that up. Sometimes when you try and go faster than usual, that happens. So once again, I'm just gonna and there we've created that nice shape. It's still a little bit messy on the outside. So rather than keeping these triangles, I'm just gonna pull these up. Watching out for little problems like this also, because you can see that's going to create a little bit of a mess. And I'm pretty pedantic with things like that, so even though I'm not mathematically trying to keep all the distances the same, I will go in and make sure that all these little problems are fixed up. For these inset parts, I can just go in and add some more details. And there you go. That's how you create little inset details like that that end up being completely smooth and problem-free, and you're able to do any shape you want. So the next thing we want to move on to is details like this, where you might have a slightly curved surface, but you just want to inset a bit of detail that merges down into a point. And there's a very specific topology required to keep this looking like this and smoothing correctly without making the edge kind of more loose up the top and tighter down the bottom here. So that'll be the next process we run through. So in order to create this specific item, the same thing applies. I'm just going to go in and create a plane, assign our material. But for this one, I probably don't need as many vertical edge loops. So I'm just going to drop that down to 3. Actually, we'll keep it at 4. I'm just going to hide everything but these 2 objects and just move it slightly out of the way. Convert it to an editable poly. Now the first thing I want to do is, and once again, it's not exactly an ideal situation because we don't have the rest of the model out here that we're putting this detail into. But the first thing I want to do is make sure that this top part is rounded the way I want to. So using the edge extrusion, I can just drag that out. The next phase will be creating the loops to be able to pull in that geometry. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select these 2 and I'm just going to chamfer it. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this inside point and just pull it in. Now what I want to do is I want to add another point in between here and connect down here. You'll be left over with some excess edge loops, so just select those. You can use the edge loop tool and just control remove them. Now you're left with 2 triangles that can be removed, and we've got the basis for our inset. The next step will be creating the support loops to create hardness here. So what I like to do is I select all 4 of these, do a ring select, and when I connect, I use 2 segments and just pinch it really close together. You'll be left with these excess loops that I just like to get rid of quickly. So I'll just select those and once again hit Control Remove. Now we've got our inset created, but it might not exactly be rounded the way you want. So what I like to do here is I get rid of these if I do need to go in and change the angle of this inset. So like I was saying, I'll select those loops, get rid of them, and then when I select these inside parts, I've got a much cleaner way to move those around. So now I can get it rounding backwards. But we're back with those two triangles again. So to get rid of those, once again, just select these inside edge loops or edge rings and connect those. And I'm just going to reset that by right-clicking those so we've got only one segment. Now I want to go in and select those vertices, and to keep things distributed a little bit more nicely, I'm just going to make sure edge constraints turned on and just pull those up. Up the top here, to create some hardness, I'm just going to connect an edge, pull it in, and then pull it out. Unlike other areas, now we've got a situation where that bevel we've just created, or that edge loop to create the hardness here, isn't evenly distributed up the top here. So I'll select these two and just move them in, without edge constraint toggle on, just to keep the distance between here and here the same all the way around. But like I was saying, because we can't see things by eye, moving them like this isn't that much of an issue. So now if I have my turbo smooth on, you should see everything's as low poly as possible. The point here flows very nicely into a hard area and doesn't cause any pinching. So that's just another cool type of detail you can put into your mesh, and you can do this anywhere as long as it's not too round or too bent. To further reduce the amount of edge loops you've got being terminated at the back here, what you can do is you can merge these 2 points together, just like we did up the top here. Get rid of the excess again, and then get rid of this point. However, on bendy surfaces, this isn't always ideal, and it can lead to a visible artifact. So just be careful of things like that. If you've got any kind of roundness on your surface, sometimes what you might need to do to avoid that is select through here and make a connection. And then just add another little point in between. Now you'll see that there's a slight hardness here. So if that's not exactly what you want, feel free not to use that. But if you're not, I'd probably recommend not terminating those points. But now you can see down the bottom here, we've got all that detail on the inside surface, on the inside of the object, but on the edge we've still got the exact same amount of edge loops as when we started, except for down here. You can do the exact same up the top also. So connecting these 2 points and removing the inside one. And then here I'm just going to select these edges, pull them in, and do the same here. And there you go. So it's smooth from all sides. There's no pinching. And it's a really nice and quick way to add detail to your objects. So the next part we're going to create is rounded circular insets on a cylindrical object. It's a very simple method of creating circles in here, but it's just slightly different to what I'd usually recommend, where you are already starting from a fully completed cylinder. In this case, we're going to create detail on a flat surface and then bend it into the shape of a cylinder, which I think is a much better way of doing things in terms of keeping your geometry from looking like it's pinching on rounded surfaces. Now, even though it's going to look less messy doing things this way, you don't always have the luxury of doing it, because sometimes it takes a bit more of a preemptive look at your design when making those decisions. So to give you an example of how you'd create something like this, what I'll do is as usual, we're just going to start from a plane. And I'm actually going to keep this one a little bit more simple. Just make sure that it's the same width